In this video, we're going to begin speaking about the functions of Congress. So this is chapter 11, I believe. Generally, when we talk about legislative bodies, we think of three different functions: representation, legislation or writing laws, and oversight of the executive. And right now I'm going to talk first about representation. In other words, the people that are elected are supposed to in some sense, represent voters or constituents. But this is certainly not as simple as it sounds. The one big question about what we mean by representation is whether we're referring to what we call a delegate version of representation or a trustee version of representation. A delegate version of representation is the notion that a representative should do what they're told by their constituents. But this is also not quite as simple as it seems, because the one question that emerges very quickly is, what set of constituents is one talking about? Is one talking about the voters that voted for that person in the primary elections, or in the general election, or are they talking about geographic constituents, like everybody in the district? This is not easily resolvable. Another version of representation is the trustee version of representation, that they are, in some sense, doing what they think is best, given their own good judgment and wider access to information about the issue at hand. And this invites other kinds of questions as well, whether one's doing what's best for constituents. Is it the party that's important here? Because party, after all, working together as a party enables one to carry out an agenda. And without working as a group through a party, one can't really carry out an agenda. And so, nobody's interests are served. Or are we talking about the national interest in some ways? And so we often see conflicts between these kinds of pressures. Now, given this representation function, we clearly see that members of Congress have what's called an incumbent advantage. People who are currently in office have a pretty easy time getting reelected. We call this the incumbent advantage. There is a chart in your textbook that represents this data, but here's another one. And we see that members of Congress House members get reelected at a rate of about 95%, and senators have a lower reelection rate, but still extremely high. So there it is right there. In the election that was just held, I think there were only 4 House members that lost races, and 2 senators out of the 33 that were up. So in this race, certainly the incumbent advantage held tight. And of course this is problematic given the fact that, overall approval rating of Congress is fairly low. So we might ask the question, well, why do incumbents have such an easy time getting reelected? And one is that they are able to have a connection with their constituents that, of course, challengers, the people running against them, can't have. They can offer services to their constituents in the form of setting up tours or helping constituents with different kinds of issues they might have with a federal agency. And this is very effective at building loyalty. Other kinds of things that members of Congress can do, as described by Mayhew, and you'll see this in the textbook: advertising, credit claiming, position taking. he talks about how, for instance, members of Congress have free mailings that they can take advantage of to every household in their district as a way to communicate with them, but it gives them an advantage. And those, sometimes they look like flyers, sometimes they're embossed letters that are sent to every household, form a connection and name recognition that's very valuable. They are limited. I think they can only send out one mailing per year, I think 2 per term, and they're not allowed to mention anything about re-election in those. But they wouldn't want to, because these are not to be seen as election advertising, because then people will just throw them right into the trash can. Credit claiming is another advantage, and that is that members of Congress can do things like acquire money for different kinds of things in the district. One of the local representatives, for instance, was able to get a couple $100,000 for police radios for North County police stations, and was able to take credit for that and show up at the ceremony and advertise the fact that they had brought this valuable commodity to the district. And position taking is another example of this. Position taking is the advantage that incumbents have, being seen as taking positions on important matters rather than electioneering. So, for instance, if you're a current member of Congress and there's some important education issue that's coming down the pike, you might call up a local PTA and say, hey, I want to come speak at your PTA meeting. And the PTA will say, oh my goodness, a member of Congress wants to come speak to us. Of course you can. And they'll feel very honored. If a challenger were to call up the PTA, well, the people at the PTA, first they might say, well, I'm sorry, who are you? And then the second thing they might say is, wait a minute, this is not an electoral forum. You can't come speak here. And they'll be seen as inevitably making election speeches rather than, taking positions in this important and authoritative kind of way. So these things all help an awful lot. Another issue that's very important, I'll let you think about it for a minute, it is money. The incumbents have an advantage when it comes to raising money. One of the things that we see, for instance, is that PACs give 85% of election donations to incumbents from both parties. That means they give very little money to people who are not currently in office, and this makes a very big difference. Let me show you some data from opensecrets.org. First, I want to show you a race from 2006. We have 2 here to look at. 2006. Let me just flip this here. This is old data, but it doesn't matter. 2000, the very similar situation. So this is Susan Davis running in a district that covers downtown San Diego. She raised, in that race, $343,000. And she spent $430,000, and she still had, after the race was over, $435,000. And this is what's called the campaign war chest. She'll just hang on to that just in case she needs it. She's not allowed to use it for any personal expenses. She must only use it for campaigns. But she'll hang on to it. She didn't need all of her money this time around. And you can see in that race she raised 54% of her money from individuals and 43% from PACs. That's the PACs right there. Very typical to get that much from PACs. Now her challenger in that race was a guy named John Woodrum. He raised $93,000. And you can see he got very little money from PACs, almost none. Most of the money he raised was his own money that he put into the race. This race is very typical. It gives you a good sense of the imbalance in fundraising between an incumbent and challengers. But money is really not everything. Let me show you another race from that same year that will give you a sense of the other kinds of things that can happen. Sorry, let me flip to it. I thought I had it open. So this is from the same year, and I want to go to Bilbray in 2006 and look at that race. And Brian Bilbray in that race raised a lot of money, $2.5 million. And he spent more than that, so that means he came into the race with some on hand and went through part of his campaign war chest. He was himself an incumbent. He was the incumbent, but only for a very short period. He had taken over the seat from somebody who was in jail for taking bribes. So he didn't have a whole lot of time to build name recognition or credit claiming. He raised 44% of his money from PACs, so even though he was a very short-term incumbent, very typical in terms of the amount he raised from PACs. Francine Busby was the challenger, and look at how much she raised in that year. $3.6 million. She outraised him and outspent him in that race. Now, she got some from PAC. She was a challenger who was getting a fair amount of attention, so she did get money from PACs, but again, not as much as usually an incumbent will get from PACs. And but she didn't win, right? And so something else is going on here. Money certainly does not guarantee that somebody's going to win a race. So what other kind of an issue is at stake? Well, this district was the 50th in that year. It ran from Mesa College up through Camp Pendleton and a little bit north of that. So it included North County Coastal and a little bit inland. And if you're familiar with that area, it's a heavily Republican area. And so the third reason here, party in the district, right? So in that district, it was so overwhelmingly Republican that any Democrat was going to have a very hard time winning. And so we want to spend a little bit of time talking about party in the district. Many seats are what we call safe seats. And I'll give you a visual on this real fast. Safe seats are ones in which the dividing line between the parties is more than 20%. So here's a graphic that gives you a sense of how this has changed over time. These are the counties in which the spread between one party or another is more than 20%. So in 1992 it was 38%. 2012 now, 50% of voters live in counties where the spread is so great that the other party really doesn't have any chance of winning. So in these what we call safe seats or safe districts, competition is severely impeded, and the incumbent has an advantage, partly for that reason. Now, also related to this is the question of gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is using redistricting or drawing election maps to affect the results. We draw campaign maps after every 10-year census, and at the federal level, of course, we're talking about the House, not the Senate. We're talking about the House because the Senate, of course, the boundaries are the entire state. But when it comes to the House, the maps have to be redrawn to show where population is. We're also talking about maps in the state level, so state assemblies and state senates. In most states, these maps are drawn by the legislative branch, the same people that are elected by them. Supreme Court does provide some guidelines for these maps. They are supposed to be the same size in terms of population, and the maps are not supposed to be solely based on incumbency, on race, on party, but in practice, the Supreme Court doesn't really like to strike maps down. And so we often see these things as being a very important factor because they're hard to distinguish in many cases from what we call communities of interest, which is a reason that the Supreme Court accepts for the maps to be drawn. So let me show you how this looks. Let me show you just a couple of things here. First off, in terms of the process, this is, I'm sorry, you can't see the whole, let me move this out. This is a map showing what happens after the census. So after the 2010 census, they went around and counted where everybody was, and they found that a lot of people moved from these yellow states down to the purple states. And so that means that the purple states got additional seats and the yellow states didn't. Lost seats. And so maps had to be drawn to reflect that. And of course within the states as well, people move around. And so every map has to have an equal number of people in it. So redistricting happens after every census. And the process for this can be very effective. Let me just show you an example of how this works. It's a simulation called the redistricting game, and I just want to show it to you real fast. We're not going to, if you're in a class about the Congress solely, you might spend time actually doing this, but I'm just going to set it up. The redistricting game gives you an idea about how map makers use software to really target, pinpoint very precisely where voters are in order to have a most effective redistricting for the party possible. And this is actually, how they do it. Every household, and whether there are Republicans or Democrats or neither living in that household, is public information, and it's fed into a database. So you can see these are households. These are where voters are, red, blue, and white, and they're all distributed around. And every district has a certain number of people in it. Now, according to this simulation, every district is supposed to have between 640,000 and 650,000 people. And you can see you can kind of draw the lines and move them around a little bit. Let me see if I can do this. And you end up picking up more people and changing how many people are in the district, and also changing the party balance based on where you draw these lines, right? Now, and it used to be the case that this was done kind of by hand, and they'd kind of try to figure it out. Now we have really sophisticated software programs that enable us to do this in a very precise way. So gerrymandering is even more important now than it used to be. So here's an example of what gerrymandering can do. North Carolina, in 2008, before the most recent redistricting, voters cast 54% of the votes for Democrats in the House races, in all of the House races. And they ended up winning 8 out of 13 seats. So not very imbalanced, right? After the redistricting, so here's where they redistricted right here. Democrats still won a majority of all the votes cast, but they only won 4 of the 13 seats. And this is all because of gerrymandering, the maps being drawn. And so the result of this nationwide was that the Democrats lost the House to the Republicans, even though 1.4 million more votes were cast for Democrats than for Republicans. And so it sort of gave this impression that that the country had sort of shifted to the Republican Party, when in fact it was a result of gerrymandering, right? So this is all of the different states and how many House seats they have. And the dark colored ones are ones in which there's a severe imbalance between the number of votes cast and the number of seats that the party managed to win. So here's North Carolina. There were more Democratic votes cast, but they managed to produce many more Republican House seats. And they did that in 6 states. The Democrats only managed to do it in 1. So both parties will do this if they can, but what happened is that the Republicans were very effective at winning control over state legislatures in the 2010 legislative elections. So gerrymandering makes a big difference to this issue of the incumbent advantage, so important to keep in mind. Now in California, we shifted to a process in which the maps are drawn by a nonpartisan Citizens Redistricting Commission instead of by the legislative branch. And so we can see that in the state of California, we ended up without any kind of an imbalance, even though the Democrats did control all of the would have been able to if they had controlled the maps, because we had turned it over to a Citizens Redistricting Commission. There was not an imbalance. So there's people in other states are looking to California now to see if they would like to adopt a similar kind of process. The problem, of course, is that you have to, this has to be passed by the very people that draw the maps. Okay, so that's the issue of representation. I'll come back to the issue of legislation in the next video.